Welcome to the Maniac Sky Japan YouTube channel. Today, let's dive into and decipher cover regulation to implementing regulation. EU 219947, Article 5, specific category of UAS operations.
Phew, that is quite the heavy regulatory title.
Right, it is a mouthful. But before your eyes just totally glaze over at that jargon, imagine a drone the size of a refrigerator, carrying a payload of highly flammable industrial chemicals, and it's flying autonomously directly over a busy city intersection.
Which sounds completely like science fiction, I know.
Exactly. But who says that's legal?
Yeah.
Who actually makes sure it doesn't just fall out of the sky onto traffic? The reality of where drone technology is going is so much bigger.
Yeah.
And honestly, a lot more intense than just someone flying a plastic quadcopter in the park on a Sunday.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the airspace right above our heads is going through this massive transformation right now. We are moving far, far beyond those basic recreational flights. And the rules governing that space, well, they have to evolve to prevent total chaos.
Yeah, they really do.
So, if you're listening right now, you might be wondering, why does a deep dive into European Union drone regulations actually matter to you?
Right. Why should they care about this EU framework?
Well, whether you are an aspiring commercial drone pilot who wants to push the boundaries and perform more advanced flights, or maybe you're just an insanely curious learner wondering how governments are trying to control the skies as drones take on these heavy, complex tasks, this is basically your ultimate cheat sheet.
Your cheat sheet to the future of the skies.
Yeah. Understanding this specific framework gives you a window into the future of global airspace management as a whole.
And that brings us to our mission for today's deep dive. We have this really fascinating 10-slide presentation that outlines the European Union's framework for these advanced drone or UAS operations. So looking at slide 1, we get our title and scope.
Right.
It's focusing on the requirements, authorizations, and declarations for this specific category. Essentially, this is the legal blueprint for operating a drone when you exceed the basic limitations.
Exactly. You're stepping out of that simple, low-risk, open category and venturing into the wild, highly regulated world of the specific category.
Yeah, the Wild West, but with a lot more paperwork.
Lots of paperwork. The core philosophy here is really a shift in responsibility. In the basic open category, the government sets a rigid box of rules like, staying under a certain weight or always keeping the drone in your visual line of sight.
And as long as you stay in the box, you're fine.
Right. As long as you stay in the box, you're safe. But the specific category just throws out the box entirely. It moves from general safety guidelines into highly tailored, meticulously documented operational plans where the burden of proving safety falls entirely on the operator.
Wow. Okay, so when do you actually cross that invisible boundary? Moving on to slide 2, we see exactly what triggers this specific category.
Yes, the trigger.
The presentation explicitly states that a UAS operation gets bumped into the specific category the exact moment it fails to meet at least one of the requirements laid down for the open category. And that falls under Article 4 or Part A of the Annex.
Think about the limitations of that open category for a second. They are designed to be inherently low risk. But let's say you're a commercial operator inspecting a massive oil pipeline.
Okay, sure.
You physically cannot keep the drone in your direct visual line of sight for a 20-mile stretch. The moment your drone flies over the horizon, you breach a foundational rule of the open category.
And boom, you are instantly reclassified.
Instantly.
It's kind of like graduating from riding a tricycle in your driveway to suddenly needing a driver's license for the Autobahn.
That is a great analogy. The stakes completely change.
Yeah, and slide 2 points out that the fundamental requirement for operations in this new category is obtaining an operational authorization from the competent authority in the member state of registration.
Right. You can't just go out, buy a heavy drone, launch it over a pipeline, and, hope for the best.
Definitely not.
The member state where the drone is registered acts as the primary gatekeeper here. They have to review your proposed flight plan and officially give you the green light. And to be clear, they do not hand out these authorizations easily.
Which brings us to the massive hurdle you have to clear first, if you'll direct us to the next part.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving to slide 3, you can't just ask for permission, right? You have to prove you are safe. Before an operator even applies, they must submit a comprehensive risk assessment per Article 11.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and this enormous document has to be submitted right alongside the application. It's the heavy lifting of the specific category. You have to map out every detail of your proposed flight.
Okay, let's unpack this because, comprehensive risk assessment sounds like peak corporate jargon.
Yeah.
What exactly are they looking for here? Does the operator just sign a piece of paper that says, hey, I check the weather, and I promise I won't crash.
I mean, a promise definitely won't get you off the ground. The operator actually has to propose concrete mitigating measures to keep the operation safe.
Mitigating measures. So like what?
It's an empirical, mathematical proof of safety. You have to prove you've thought of every single thing that could possibly go wrong, like a catastrophic motor failure, a sudden loss of GPS, a severe downdraft,
Right.
and then show exactly how your systems will prevent it or, contain the damage if it does happen.
Yet you really have to show your work. You have to say, like, if the main battery fails over a populated area, I have an independent backup system and an automatic parachute deployment mechanism.
Precisely. You are building a layered defense. It's not just hoping for the best. And once you submit that giant stack of evidence, the government takes over.
Which leads us to the government's role. On slide 4, we see issuing the operational authorization. The competent authority evaluates the application,
Right.
and they only issue the authorization if they consider the operational risks to be, quote, adequately mitigated.
Right.
Now, hold on a second. Adequately mitigated sounds like a pretty massive regulatory loophole. Who defines what adequate is? Isn't that totally subjective depending on which government inspector happens to read your file that day?
It sounds subjective, sure, but the regulatory framework standardizes it. The whole concept of adequate mitigation acknowledges a fundamental truth of aviation, which is that there is no such thing as zero risk.
Okay, fair enough.
The authority's job isn't to guarantee that nothing will ever fall from the sky under any circumstance. Their job is to ensure the operator has layered enough safety measures to reduce the statistical probability of a catastrophic failure to an acceptable threshold.
Right, for that specific operation.
Exactly. Flying over an empty desert requires a very different definition of adequate than flying over a hospital.
That makes a lot of sense. It scales directly with the danger of the environment, and the authorities are incredibly careful about what exactly they are approving.
Yes, very careful.
Moving to slide 5, we look at the scope of the authorization. These authorizations are definitely not blank checks.
No, absolutely not. If you look at slide 5, the authorizations are very specific. The authority explicitly specifies the scope.
So they lock you in.
They do. The parameters are extremely tight. An authorization might be granted for a single, highly specific operation, for instance, flying a heavy cinema camera on a drone for a movie stunt.
Right, but only on a closed set, and only next Tuesday between 2:00 p.m. and 4:00 p.m.
Exactly. Very narrow.
But the slide also mentions it could be broader, right? Like, they might approve multiple operations defined by specific times and locations.
Yeah, that happens too, like a logistics company getting approval to run agricultural surveys over a designated network of farms every morning for an entire season.
Oh, I see.
But regardless of whether it's one flight or 100 flights, the authorization always comes with the precise list of those mitigating measures attached to it. The operator is legally bound to fly exactly how they promised they would fly in their risk assessment.
So if you said you'd have visual observers stationed on the ground, you must actually have them there.
You have to have them there, no exceptions.
But man, doing a bespoke risk assessment and waiting for government approval for every single new route sounds like an absolute nightmare for a growing business.
It really does, which is why slide 5 introduces a crucial concept, the Light UAS Operator Certificate, or LUC, under Part C of the Annex.
Right, the LUC. We're going to dive into how that acts as a sort of VIP pass in just a moment. But first, please let me know your thoughts in the comments, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe. Even though I'm in AI, your support really boosts my motivation to improve my pronunciation and create better content for you.
I always love seeing the feedback in the comments. It really helps shape these discussions.
It really does. All right, we are back. So before the break, we talked about how grueling the full operational authorization process can be, and you mentioned the LUC. But what if you are a smaller commercial operator who just wants to do routine flights without spending months on paperwork? Is there an easier way?
There is, thankfully. Let's look at slide 6, which introduces the declaration alternative. This uses what they call standard scenarios, or STS, from Appendix 1.
Oh, I love this concept. It's basically like ordering off a set menu at a restaurant instead of demanding the chef invent a totally custom meal for you from scratch.
That is exactly the right way to think about it. Regulators recognize that certain types of drone operations are performed constantly across the industry.
Like what?
For example, flying a drone over a controlled ground area to inspect a cell tower. Instead of forcing every single operator to reinvent the wheel and submit a custom risk assessment for that exact same routine task, the government created these predefined standard scenarios.
So if the regulatory authority has already calculated the risks and established the rules for inspecting a cell tower, you just point to the menu and say, "I'll take the STS meal, please."
Pretty much. If your planned operation strictly complies with every single limitation and mitigation of a published standard scenario, you get to bypass the full authorization process entirely.
That is huge.
It is. You just submit a specific declaration form outlined in Appendix 2 to the competent authority. You are officially declaring, I am doing this predefined operation, and I will follow all the predefined rules.
It streamlines the process immensely. But wait, some operators get it even easier, right? Let's look at slide 7, which covers exemptions from authorization and declaration. Some folks get to skip the line entirely.
They do. There are some real VIPs in this framework. The slide lists 2 main exemptions. Exemption 1 goes back to that light UAS Operator Certificate, the LUC that we touched on earlier.
Right, the master key.
Yeah, if a company holds an LUC with the appropriate privileges, they are completely exempt from needing a new operational authorization or even a standard declaration for flights that fall within their approved scope.
Because they've already proven their whole organization is bulletproof.
Exactly. They operate under their own umbrella. They authorize themselves.
They literally hold the golden ticket. And then there's exemption 2, which I find genuinely hilarious. The exemption covers operations conducted within the framework of model aircraft clubs and associations that already have an authorization under Article 16.
Yes, the hobbyists.
So basically the old school RC plane club members, sitting out in lawn chairs, flying their wooden gliders, are holding a regulatory VIP pass, leaving all the tech bro drone delivery startups incredibly jealous.
It is quite the juxtaposition. But, the logic behind Article 16 is sound. Regulators aren't trying to destroy a hobby that has existed for decades.
True, they've been doing it forever.
And model aircraft clubs usually have long-established safety cultures. They have designated flying fields away from the public and strict internal guidelines. The law respects that historical safety record.
So the club gets the authorization, not the individual.
Right. Instead of forcing every hobbyist to navigate commercial drone regulations, the club itself gets an overarching authorization and its members just fly under that protective umbrella.
It's a great example of the regulation adapting to reality rather than forcing reality to adapt to the regulation. Okay, so we've covered standard flights, organizational privileges, and hobbyist clubs. But this is where the deep dive takes a serious turn. Yeah. What if your drone isn't just carrying a camera or a sensor? What if you're carrying something hazardous? Moving on to slide 8, we enter the danger zone. Transport of dangerous goods, general principles.
Yeah, transporting dangerous goods by drone, industrial chemicals, infectious medical samples, or highly flammable materials is a massive frontier for logistics right now.
And the specific category does allow it, right?
It does allow it, but the regulations become incredibly stringent.
Right. The slide lays out the primary caveat very clearly. The transport of dangerous goods is allowed only if the operator demonstrates these goods will not cause harm to third parties or the environment in the event of an accident.
And notice the phrasing there. It doesn't say, if you prove you won't crash.
Yeah. It assumes you will crash and demands you prove the cargo won't cause a massive disaster when it hits the ground.
That assumption of failure is critical. And the mandatory mitigation listed on slide 8 is the use of a crash-protected container. You cannot just duct tape a vial of hazardous biological material to the landing gear.
Right. And it's not just a matter of buying a tough metal box online either. The slide emphasizes that the container's conformity must account for specific operational characteristics. You have to factor in the flight speed, the altitude, the weather conditions, and the geographical area.
The geographical area is the most crucial variable here. And on the next slide, slide 9, we see exactly why.
Okay, looking at slide 9.
This slide details the intense risk assessment required specifically for dangerous goods. You have to evaluate the hazard posed by the actual quantity and the class of the goods. A heavy payload of lithium batteries requires entirely different safety margins than, say, a small vial of a corrosive chemical.
Right. But how does the geography factor into the physical container? If a box is crash-proof, shouldn't it just be crash-proof everywhere?
You would think so, but not according to physics. What's fascinating here is how the container's physical characteristics must directly correlate with the exact terrain. Think about the kinetic energy of a crash. A crash-protected container engineered to survive a 200-foot drop into a soft, muddy agricultural field might shatter completely if dropped from the exact same height onto urban concrete.
Oh, wow. The concrete versus grass drop test.
Exactly. The risk assessment has to prove that the container's structural integrity is robust enough for the exact terrain of the specific flight path.
You literally have to map your route down to the surface density of the ground below you. That is wild. And on top of that, Slide 9 states you must account for risks to personnel directly handling the goods, third parties who might be near the crash site, and the broader environmental impact if, a leak occurs near a water source.
It requires a level of expertise that goes far, far beyond just being a skilled drone pilot. You essentially have to become a hazardous materials logistics expert.
Which brings us directly to the final slide, Slide 10, training requirements. To do this legally, operators must establish a highly specific dangerous goods training program for all involved personnel. And naturally, that program is subject to approval by the competent authority.
Yes, the training curriculum mandated here is exhaustive. It has to cover terminology, classification, and labeling of hazardous materials.
Right. The slide specifically mentions using safety data sheets and the GHS, which is the globally harmonized system.
Yes, exactly.
For those who aren't familiar, the GHS is that international system of hazard pictograms. The little diamonds with a flame or a skull and crossbones or the exploding bomb icon. The drone crew has to know exactly what those chemical classifications mean and how the substance behaves under stress.
They do. They also need detailed instructions on safe storage, handling, loading, and the segregation of incompatible goods.
Segregating incompatible goods is essentially a very dry regulatory way of saying, don't put the match next to the fireworks while flying at 400 feet.
Pretty much. The crew has to understand chemical reactions. You can't put a highly reactive oxidizer next to a flammable liquid.
And finally, perhaps the most critical part of the training on Slide 10 is defining the emergency and reporting procedures to be included in the Emergency Response Plan, or the ERP.
Let's walk through that for a second. An ERP is a predetermined, step-by-step action plan. If a drone carrying toxic chemicals crashes in a suburban area, the personnel on the ground can't be panicking and wondering what to do.
Right, you can't be figuring it out on the fly.
Exactly. The ERP dictates exactly who to call local fire departments, environmental protection agencies, how to establish a safe perimeter, and what specific chemical neutralizers might be needed. The training ensures the team executes that plan flawlessly to mitigate the impact immediately.
It is an overwhelming amount of responsibility. Stepping out of the open category and into the specific category isn't just a matter of, filling out a form to unlock new flight privileges. It's about an organization adopting a totally new level of operational maturity, safety culture, and liability.
It really is. Looking at the entire framework we've decoded today, it serves as a masterclass in how society attempts to balance rapid technological innovation with vital public safety.
A tough balance to strike.
Definitely. Regulators are not trying to ground drones or stifle the industry. They are trying to build an architecture where complex, high-stakes operations can scale without putting people on the ground at risk.
Right.
And they are using rigorous risk assessments, standard scenarios, organizational audits, and stringent training to thread that needle.
It is an incredible balancing act. And honestly, reading through how meticulous it all is makes me feel a bit better about the future of our airspace.
It does provide some reassurance, but, it also leaves us with a profound question as we look forward. The technology is advancing rapidly.
Yeah, it's not slowing down.
If we reach a point where crash-protected containers of dangerous goods, whether that's industrial chemicals or vital medical supplies, are routinely flying overhead as part of our normal everyday logistics networks, how will our city infrastructures and even our own daily psychology need to physically and psychologically adapt to that new reality?
That is a wild thing to picture. Just walking out to get your mail, looking up and knowing exactly what kinds of hazardous materials are passing through the sky above your neighborhood. What do you think? Would you feel comfortable with a drone delivering hazardous materials over your neighborhood, even with a crash-proof container? Please share your thoughts and feedback in the comments section down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. You can find links to other videos in this series in the description box, so be sure to check them out. I'll see you in the next video from Maniac Sky Japan. Goodbye and take care.